This is episode number 57 of the Fine Dining Podcast. Meet the keynote speaker at the very first Taste Trekkers Food Tourism Conference, Chef Matt Jennings.
This is the Fine Dining Podcast. The Fine Dining Podcast. For foodies who love travel and travelers who love food. Here's your host, Seth Ressler.
Hello and welcome to the Fine Dining Podcast. This is the podcast for foodies who love travel and travelers who love food. My name is Seth Ressler, and here's how it works. Every week we go to a different city and we talk to somebody who really knows the local culinary scene. Sometimes it's a food blogger, sometimes it's a food event organizer, sometimes it's a chef. And today, I'm really excited. We are talking to the keynote speaker of the very first Taste Trekkers Food Tourism Conference, which is just, first of all, he's got a long list of accolades that go well beyond that. He's been a James Beard Foundation Award nominee for Best Chef Northeast several years in a row at this point. Food and Wine named him one of 40 under 40 big thinkers. He was the winner of the Koshan 555 competition 3 times in a row. Had to retire himself because he kept winning the event. He's been named one of Mother Nature Network's most sustainable chefs. Matt Jennings of Farmstead in Providence, Rhode Island, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Hey, Seth, how are you?
I'm really glad that you're going to be doing this keynote address.
Well, I'm really glad to be doing it, and you should be excited. I think what you guys are up to with this amazing conference is pretty impressive.
Thank you for being a part of it.
Pleasure.
We got a lot to talk about with you today. First of all, we're going to get into your history, your background, how you got to where you are today. And then we want to talk about sort of the amazing things that you're doing with pork and with cheese over there at Farmstead. Talk about some of the great things that are happening in Providence, Rhode Island, because this really is a great place for food. I mean, the dining scene there is just, especially in the last few years, it's just become fantastic.
Yeah.
So we want to talk about that. And then we're going to play a game called Out of the Frying Pan. But before we get to all that, you have a trivia question for me.
Well, I figured that it was, apropos of the conference being held here in Rhode Island for the first time ever, that we should probably talk clams. You may or may not know that it was around the late 80s that our little humble quahog was elevated to the status of the Rhode Island official state shell. So I wanted to throw a clam trivia question your way.
Go for it.
Rhode Island is situated in kind of what they call, quahog country, which is really the heart of it runs between Cape Cod and New Jersey. And there is an essential piece of equipment that's needed when you are going quahogging or clamming, and if you don't have it, you're going to have a lot of hard luck and some pretty bruised fingers, so it's something to think about.
So there's a piece of equipment that you need in order to basically remove the quahogs from the water? Is that what it is?
That's right. It's a clammer's best friend.
Huh. For everything I know about quahogs, I learned from watching Family Guy. There is no city in Rhode Island named Quahog.
There's not. No, there's not.
That's a fictional place, but Seth MacFarlane's from there, right?
That's right.
An essential piece of equipment. Is this like an industrial piece of equipment, or is this something small that an individual would use?
It's pretty, they started off pretty primitive and have developed a little bit over the years, but it's a tool that's used with the skill of hand raking, which is really the best way to harvest these guys. So
we're going to think about that. We'll come back to that. While I'm thinking about that, let's talk about you. And let's start this story with, you're from Boston, you're born. What happens next?
Born and raised in Boston, grew up in JP, Jamaica Plain, spent some time out in the burbs as well. Worked as a cook. Got my first experience really as a stock boy when I was 13 in a little local grocery store, kind of being around food. And, there was a little deli attached to the grocery store, and the grocery store also owned a little cafe next door. And so as I kind of was coming up the ranks, I asked the boss man if I could get involved in the cafe, and he said, well, I don't know if you're really ready, but you can chop some onions here and there, or you can peel some cucumbers, or, wash some salad greens, and when you're done, do all the dishes and clean the whole place and sweep the floor. So that was kind of my introduction into, the hard work that it took to be in a kitchen.
And at that point, did you know that this was something you wanted to do?
No, I mean, this was really more summer job type stuff. But, I was kind of realized I was getting bit by the bug when I was spending more time at the grocery and at the restaurant than I was at home and out with my friends in the summertime, just because I loved it. And I also loved that reward of, bringing home a paycheck when I was a young kid.
Sure.
That was nice, and then would return to school in the fall, and ended up going to liberal arts college, as you would say, maybe normal, quote unquote normal college, out in Western Massachusetts for a year. It was decided both by administration and my family that it probably wasn't the best place for me. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
So I wasn't getting too much work done. Was having a lot of fun, and
right.
And we said, okay, let's take a second and regroup here and figure out what it is that I want to do. So I took a year off, and in that year off, the only thing I knew how to do was work in a kitchen from my previous experience. So I proceeded to do that for a year, and really fell in love with it. And that was kind of really when I got bit by the bug, and I realized that this was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So the following year, ended up going up to culinary school at New England Culinary Institute in Vermont after my year off, and that was off to the races from there. It was a really, really great place, and I learned a lot.
So once you graduate from culinary school, where do you go?
Graduated from culinary school and spent some time bouncing back and forth between California, the West Coast, and Boston on my internships, and landed a job as a cook in the city in Boston, and actually opened a couple different restaurants there, and was just working really hard and, doing 70, 80-hour weeks and going out and partying hard at night and doing what young cooks do. And I just kind of reached the point where I think I was working so much and so hard that I had kind of lost that love for food from a consumer standpoint. So I decided to take a little bit of a break and gave my notice in at my restaurant job, and it took a couple of weeks and ended up finding a listing in the newspaper for a cheese buyer, which I thought was really interesting. And it was for this hallowed institution in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Formaggio Kitchen, which I had heard a lot about as a young cook in Boston. All of my chefs would always talk about it and would source products from there, but I'd never actually been. So I went to Formaggio for an interview and walked in and was essentially hired on the spot.
Now, when you got hired there, did you have a particular specialty in cheese?
I didn't. I had just been a cook up to that point, and my mentor-to-be, if you will, Isan Gerdal, the owner there, I think really saw how passionate I was around food, and we ended up spending a lot of time that day in the shop just talking about the ingredients that he was selling, and I think that, he really liked that. So he did call me back for a second interview, but, in that process, I think he'd made the decision already that I was somebody that he wanted on the team. So, started there and really was brought in as somebody to learn the entire department of cheese and charcuterie at Formaggio, and to begin sourcing the product. So Isan really took me under his wing, showed me quite a bit about charcuterie and cheese and how to source it and what to look for, and sent me all over the globe buying products for the two shops that he owned. I went to Europe, Italy, France, spent some time in Austria as well, and would bring back products for the shop. So it was really, really an amazing experience, and I got to do things and see places and meet people that I never would have. And included in that was a beautiful young baker and one of the catering managers there at Formaggio at the time, who was my wife-to-be, Kate.
Nice.
That's how we met, was at Formaggio, and the rest, as they say, is history.
And congratulations. I know that you just had your second child.
We did, yeah. We just had another baby boy, so been busy.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Yep. Tell me a little bit about what you noticed as you went from place to place and how that informs, the cheese that is produced.
Being able to see what I was able to see in Europe really just opened my eyes to a new way of looking at food. It was the ability to go to open markets and buy products on the street from the farmers. It was, the ability to visit some of these producers in their homes and on their farms and see firsthand the amount of hard work and passion that goes into the products. And, that was the stuff that really kind of just kept hitting home with me. To see these people who have dedicated their lives to creating, maybe it's just one single product, maybe it's someone on a hillside in the side of Tuscany that makes one cheese and that's all they do. That stuff really resonates with me. And so I wanted to be able to find a way to bring that back to the U.S. And so I was able to do that through Formaggio for a while. And then when Kate and I decided it was time to kind of move on, she wanted to pursue her pastry career. And I wanted to see more of what the U.S. had to offer in the way of artisan foods. And then at that point, the U.S. was really starting to blossom and artisan producers were kind of coming out of the woodwork. And there was no better place to really explore that than California, as most food movements, I would say, kind of start in the Bay Area and kind of resonate eastward for the most part. We felt like it would be a great place to go and explore the next world of cuisine on the West Coast that we hadn't seen yet. So Kate went and applied at the Culinary Institute of America in St. Helena, California, in the Napa Valley, and she got in, and so we moved to Napa. So we got to see the West Coast side of things as well, which was really fascinating, and see what was going on out there simultaneously as what was happening at home. And again, we're kind of struck by the intensity of the farm to fork movement, if you will, out there, and which is now ubiquitous in the world and is seen all over the place. It was still back then pretty interesting and novel when you had chefs performing their culinary skills right on the farm, and chefs that owned farms and who were working directly with producers. And it was really about cultivating those relationships, really.
When were you out there in Napa?
2000 to 2002, right in that area. So it was kind of really the beginning of that kind of farm-to-table revolution, if you will.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of the wine came up first in Napa, because they've been doing it so long, and it became sort of a tourist destination for wine, and then the food sort of followed that. And really, one of the big things is that Thomas Keller came in with the French Laundry. Is that happening at that point?
Yeah, I would say that the influence of local artists and producers and farmers on California cuisine has been around for decades. When we were there, it wasn't as though it was anything new, but there were a lot of kind of younger chefs spinning off and doing their own projects and bringing that ethos into their restaurant. And so you were kind of seeing the second resurgence of it. You had the kind of disciples that were coming from places, like Chez Panisse and Alice Waters, and you had the disciples coming from Thomas's restaurant, and other great locations that were doing these things and kind of creating their own version of farm-focused restaurant. And so that, to me, was really interesting, seeing that next generation come up.
And just so that we're clear about what we're talking about, when we talk about the farm-to-table movement, let's do it the easy way. Tell me what we're not talking about.
We're not talking about industrialized food. I think that's the bottom line. We're not talking about food that's made without great attention to detail and small batches, created from responsibly sourced ingredients. The sustainable food movement is that focus on, the ingredients in the cuisine that create, the opportunity for sustainability through the items themselves and the utilization of products, as well as for the people that work on these farms, creating socioeconomic ability for small farms to survive. That's really what we're talking about.
Are there any Bay Area chefs that you really came to admire?
Yeah, certainly. The ones that come to mind right away, of course, are, folks like Paul Bertoli, Michael Tusk, the list goes on and on. But I think more importantly than, real individuals, it was being able to create the experience of seeing all these different kitchens and how they operated, and talk to the chefs and talked about what inspired them and understand why they sought out certain ingredients. Those experiences can never be duplicated for me. So
you do your time in California. How do you wind up back on the East Coast?
We were kind of reaching the end of Kate's schooling, and we needed to decide what we wanted to do and where we wanted to end up. We kind of realized after I was provided the opportunity to open Ferry Plaza Market with Cowgirl that it was either going to be moving into the city or it was going to be moving back east. And we kind of were just feeling like maybe it was time to go home and do our own thing. My mom had recently retired to Little Compton, Rhode Island, which is about 30 or 40 minutes south of Providence. And so we came home and visited her, and in the process kind of fell in love with southern New England again, and in particular Providence at the time, and so said, you know what, maybe this is the time that we move back.
And you started with a cheese shop.
Yeah, we did. We started with the cheese shop, and we had kind of been searching for a location, and I knew that I was going to do something by myself and open my own business. Kate at the time was working at a local bakery here, And she was kind of continuing to hone that experience while I was looking. I was having a really hard time and really defining what I wanted to do, and kind of finally said, you know what, my most recent experience is in retail. Let's focus on that, and Kate can do some baking, and we can sell her baked goods, and maybe I can do some cooking classes here and there and stuff like that. So we looked for a location for a while, couldn't find much, and then just kind of stumbled into what was then the Cheese Shop of Providence, and had been there for about 40 years, had been passed down from a couple different owners. So I walked in and met with the woman and said, have you ever thought about selling? And she said, no, this is something that I've done my whole life, and I want to hand this down to my grandkids. And so I said, okay, and left and continued my search for a location, and she ended up actually calling me the next day. She said, okay, what do you have in mind?
Makes you wonder what the grandkids did that night, huh?
Yeah, right. Once we started talking, I kind of knew that this was going to be, probably our first independent project.
This is 2003, right?
Right. So we moved forward on the space and started doing our renovations after we purchased the cheese shop. And really the focus was to kind of just get the inventory up to par and bring in some new items and reintroduce the shop to Providence. And so off to the races we went, and really just kind of ramped it up from there. She started producing some stuff for the shop, and her chocolates and her pastry and desserts and stuff, and I was sourcing items for the store and doing some of the charcuterie, and it was really just, that was the very beginning of kind of the mom and pop type shop for us.
Was there any thought in the beginning that this would eventually become a restaurant as well?
Yeah, I mean, we always talked about it, and we had a lot of customers that would come in and buy products and cheese and charcuterie and say, oh, I wish I could get a glass of wine, and we could do a cheese tasting. And so then I started kind of doing some rogue cheese classes. I'd pull in some stools at night and draw the shades, and we'd do some tastings, and we had a lot of fun with that. And I said, yeah, I would love to be able to expand the products and offerings, but we just don't have the space. And of course, as soon as I said that, the space next door became available. It was a former salon of sorts, and we said, okay, now's our opportunity. So we rented that space, busted a hole in the wall, and did the build out in there. And Kate and I actually had just gotten married. This is now 2005 and going into 2006, and we had the space leased, and we were beginning renovations, and we said, you know what, we're going to take our honeymoon. We had hired our first employee to hold down the shop while we were gone, and the restaurant at that time was under construction, and my father's an architect, so I handed him the drawings, and I said, we're going on our honeymoon, we'll be back. So while we were on our honeymoon, my father took it into his own hands to kind of create the restaurant. So we came back to a restaurant that was pretty much built out, ready to go. And I said, okay, I walked into the space and I said, oh boy, we've got a full restaurant here. So much for our little wine bar idea. We've got all this room. We've got the full kitchen. We've got the whole thing. So let's do this. I said, we don't need to hire a chef. We've got me. We don't need to hire a baker or pastry chef. We've got you. So let's give it a shot. And so that began the introduction of the restaurant space. And we started very simply. It was really just charcuterie and cheese plates and wine, and we didn't even have a full liquor license, when we started. We kind of grew into it very organically. And so our single employee that we had would basically work the shop. I was working in the kitchen, and Kate was doing the baking. And then, so our schedules were just, it was crazy. I had one cook that worked with me. I didn't have a prep cook, so I'd come in at, 7. I'd do the prep. Then I'd leave and take a nap for an hour, and then I'd come back and work service all night, and then wake up the next day and do the same thing. Likewise, Kate was coming in at 4:35, doing the bake-off till about 2, going home, walking the dog, doing whatever she had to do, and then coming back and jumping on the door at 4 o'clock and working in the front of the house for the rest of the night. So we were killing ourselves, for sure, for the first couple of years, and we really kind of held back from hiring anyone because we wanted to do it ourselves and have as much control over it as possible. And let's face it, we were cheap. We didn't have any money, and we wanted to make sure that this thing was going to fly. So we dumped our hearts and souls into it for, the first few years. And that's just the way it was.
All right, so I want to come back and I want to talk more about the exciting things that you're doing at the restaurant. I also want to talk to you about sort of the culinary scene in Providence as a whole, because I know that you've been a really big player in really shaping the entire city and the dining scene there. So we're going to come back, we're going to talk about that, plus we're going to find the answer to your trivia question, and we're going to play a game called Out of the Frying Pan. Okay, I want to tell you about this event that Matt Jennings is giving the keynote address at. That is the very first Taste Trekkers Food Tourism Conference. This is an event for anybody who plans their vacations around food, who plans their travel around food. It's really about the intersection of food and geography. I mean, different foods come from different places, and, the location really informs the cuisine. And so we're going to explore that, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to show you how you can explore the world through food. Matt's going to talk a lot about that, and then we've got a lot of great sessions that are all focusing on different cuisines of different regions, whether it's the chocolate of Madagascar, whether it's the history of rum in New England, whether it is ice cider from up in Vermont, whether it is barbecue from Memphis, whether it is Peruvian ceviche, all kinds of cool stuff. Go online, check it out. It's over at tastetrekkers.com, TASTETREKKERS.com. We are talking to Chef Matt Jennings of Farmstead in Providence. He is the keynote speaker at the Taste Trekkers Food Tourism Conference happening September 20th, 21st, and 22nd in Providence, Rhode Island. He's also been shortlisted for Best Chef Northeast by James Beard a number of years now. Won the Koshan 555 competition several years in a row. And I'm seeing you all over the place now, by the way. I just saw you quoted in a Wall Street Journal article. I didn't even know the Wall Street Journal had articles on food. There was an NPR story that just aired nationally that you were in, I think over the weekend. You're filming something for PBS, right? Movable Feast, is that?
Yeah, we just did a shoot for a PBS show called Movable Feast that focuses on kind of regionally getting some chefs together and creating a nice meal for a bunch of folks that's pretty farm driven. So we had a good time with that. We did that with our buddy Ken Oringer from Clio, so that was good.
All right, so we're going to dig into all that. But first, you had a trivia question for me. Tell me what it was again.
What we were talking about was quahogging, which is kind of a great pastime here in Rhode Island. And there's a very specific piece of equipment that's needed to successfully go clamming. And so I was asking you if you knew what that is.
Piece of equipment, and it's something that an individual can use. I mean, I'm thinking it looks something like those post holers that you use when you're digging a fence post, but...
Similar?
Yeah. I don't know what it would be called, though, other than a clam digger. I don't know. What do you call the equipment?
You're right there. I mean, it's called a bull rake, and they have typically 3 to 5 tongs on a rake. Basically, what happened was by the 50s, there were 2 groups of quahoggers that were kind of competing for those clam resources in the Narragansett Bay. There were the dredgers, who used the boats to kind of drag metal dredges across the bottom, and they could harvest really large numbers of clams. But the other school was the hand rakers, who used their own muscle power. And the hand rakers would always complain that the dredgers were, wiping the quahog population out, damaging the clams, and putting them out of work. And eventually the hand rakers won out. So today, dredging in Narragansett Bay is very restricted, if not, disallowed altogether in most areas. So bull rakes are the rakes that those hand dredgers use to harvest their clams. And if you're a good Rhode Islander or a good New Englander for that matter, you've got at least 1 or 2 bull rakes hanging in the garage.
Are we talking about areas that are under some amount of water?
Basically, we call them the flats. You get ocean water that will come in and cover it for a certain amount of time, and depending on the tides, when the tides go out, we'll leave behind some tributaries and some areas that have left some tide pools and things like that. And you want that kind of dense, heavily, moistened sand is what you're looking for. The quahogs live buried just below the surface in the bottom sand or mud. They have a couple little siphons that stick up into the water, and you look for those little holes where they're sticking their siphons up, and you go at it with your bull rake. And if you're lucky, you end up with a nice half bushel, because every Rhode Island resident is allowed a half bushel of hand-raked quahogs per day as part of the law here. So we're lucky we get to kind of go out whenever we want.
So let's get back into the Matt Jennings biography here. We've now gotten to the point where you and your wife have opened up Farmstead and it has become a full-blown restaurant. Did you have a vision for what the restaurant would be?
I mean, first and foremost, food for me has to be delicious. It has to taste good. Everything else comes after that. So first you work on making it taste as great as you can, and then you work on how it looks and the design of your plates and all that sort of stuff. But even before that, the most important thing to me is where it's coming from. So, we've always been very committed, just because it's who we are, to sourcing out those relationships with, small producers and relationships with the ingredients, because we know that the food at the end of the day can only be as good as the ingredients that we start with. That's why we're driven towards farms and small farms. We like supporting local families and keeping, the local economy at work. So all of those things are important to us, but really it's got to taste good. It's got to be responsibly sourced. So, we always knew that we wanted to be able to express those ideas in the restaurant without being preachy. It's very important to me that we didn't kind of try to stick that stuff in somebody's face, because let's face it, where we're at with this style of cuisine and this style of food is that still not everybody can afford it. And I think that there have been great strides made via, offering EBT and food stamps at farmers markets, and doing some outreach and doing some culinary demonstrations in lower income areas. But for the most part, if you're walking down the street in your neighborhood to your farmers market, you're probably living in a nice area. So we wanted to make sure that we tried to keep it as accessible as we could for everybody. So those were all important elements of when we first began. And it's been interesting to watch. I mean, we started really simply. Our food, I think, has gone through a little bit of an evolution, as I think happens in great restaurants. Not saying that we're a great restaurant, but I think these sorts of things happen when you put yourself in a place where you're committed and you're passionate and you really care. When you care and you work hard to show people that you care, then there's a great result that occurs. For us, the result has been having an amazing team and having people who want to work here, who are committed and who are excited every day about the product and who engage with customers and tell the story. And, we wouldn't be where we are without our people.
Let me ask you, in addition to cheese, the one other thing that you have become known for is pork. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so for whatever reason, the swine and I have a great affinity for each other. I think that, one of the things that has always turned me on is utilization. And so being a penny pincher and a business owner, you learn to utilize your products the best that you can so that you're maximizing your profit. And when the pigs started coming into my life, I think I broke down my first pig when I was 20 with the chef that I worked with, and was able to kind of experience how best to utilize each part of the animal. I was fascinated by that and kept wanting to learn about that more and more. So, I worked into situations where I was, doing some charcuterie at some of the restaurants that I worked at, or at Formaggio, doing some work there to learn a little bit more about the pig and sell some of the items through the shop. So when I opened Farmstead, it was a no-brainer that I would continue that and, would continue my relationship with whole animals and being able to cook, head to tail, if you will. So it's something we've always done since day one and something we've always been committed to. And I think it just comes with the territory. It's part of being a well-rounded cook. And unfortunately, these days, our cooks are not learning as much as they should about butchery and animal husbandry and use. And so we've made it a goal of ours in our restaurant to be able to teach our young cooks about that as well. I think butchery is a really important part of the whole package of becoming a cook. So that lives on here in a lot of different ways. The charcuterie that's created in-house. We've also participated in a lot of kind of hog cooking competitions, which we've fared well at. And so there's a good relationship there between us and the pig.
Let me ask you about sort of nose-to-tail cooking. I have to imagine that when you work in a restaurant, there are certain dishes that are in higher demand than others. How do you balance out and make sure that you use the whole animal given that? I mean, do you have to get creative or what do you do?
Sure, you have to get creative, but like I said, it's also about making it delicious, and I think it's about educating your consumer. And so if you have customers who are willing to try something new, then you work with them and you say, if you like that, you'll love this, and you got to try this head cheese that I made. Well, what's head cheese? Well, you explain it, and this is part of being a butcher and a cook, is learning to maximize the usage of these animals. These animals have paid the ultimate sacrifice, right? They paid the ultimate price. They have put themselves on our table. So it's really our duty to use them and use every part of them and not be wasteful. That's the mentality behind it. And once you talk to people about that in particular, I think they begin to understand it a little bit more, and they become a little bit more willing to try new things. And, we love taking whole animals in because it forces us to really use our brains. And, when we have a day where I get a couple hogs and a hind quarter of beef and a lamb and all of our fish in the back door from our fishermen. We got a lot going on, and my guys are scrambling, and we're trying to figure out how to maximize everything, within the couple hours that we have. That's when you're at your best as a cook, and you're really using every part of your brain to think about, okay, what's this going to be? What are we going to do with this? How's this going to get prepared? What do we have in-house that we can use to make this taste interesting and delicious, and challenge yourself. And when you continue to challenge yourself, it's when you create the best food.
And you mentioned the competitions. I mean, talk to me about Cochon.
Yeah, so Cochon I hooked up with a number of years back. We had found out that there was this guy who was planning on hosting pork cooking competitions around the country. I think I was introduced to him by a buddy of mine in the Bay Area who's a butcher, who was coming off being a chef at the time and moving into his butchery business, Ryan Farr of 4505 Meats. And we got together with Brady, and I said, God, you got to do Providence, man. I'm doing all this stuff here, and there's a lot of other people that are doing interesting things there, and, you got to come. We should do a Cochon Providence. And it wasn't originally scheduled for his tour. And he said, well, I don't really, I don't know if I'm going to go down to Providence. I'm focusing on major markets right now, but, I'll keep you posted. And then he ended up reaching out to me because it was his goal in every market to kind of have a dark horse or an underdog, So he said, I'm doing Boston, and I've got this chef, and this chef, but we kind of want an underdog. I want somebody to kind of come in. The goal is always to have somebody that people don't know too much about. And so I said, yeah, absolutely. The first year, we decided to do it. So we entered and we won. We, kept it really simple. The first year, I think we just did kind of like 3 different items, basically. The goal is at every Cochon is always to create food both for an audience of up to 500, as well as a small selection of kind of carefully planned menu for a table of judges. And then the vote is split between the public and the judges. So we were kind of able to do a little bit of everything, For the public, we focused on doing kind of that real flavor-driven, kind of simple, rustic cuisine that we were known for. And then for the judges, we kind of got to play around and do a little bit more refined platings and some really interesting stuff for them, which was also something that, we were interested in. And so out of those 2 different opportunities, we took home the Golden Piggy for the first year and won and knocked all the, prominent Boston chefs off the stage, which was a pretty great feeling.
Let me just say that having lived in Providence and knowing this, people from Providence take special pride when they're able to outdo people in Boston at something, right? I mean, there's a little bit of so.
Right. Well, I mean, I think for me it was even sweeter because I'd grown up in Boston and, had worked alongside or within, shouting distance from a lot of these guys, and I think they look down on Providence in a way, right? And we're kind of like, oh, it's Jennings from Providence, and whatever. And so to win that first one was pretty awesome, and I think was really great for the city, here as well.
Yep,
took some pride in it, and then that kind of put us on the national stage as being a place that was dedicated to this type of cooking. And so it was kind of nice. I was like, yeah, exactly. We've been doing this for a while. It's about time people, notice what we're up to. And so that kind of was a good feeling. And then, subsequently we were invited back the next year and won again. And it was a new list of contenders, and so felt even sweeter to kind of take on some new folks. And the third year we were invited back, and they had brought in some of their big guns, wonderful chefs who are dear friends of mine now, who kind of defined the Boston culinary scene, like Lydia Shire and some others.
Yeah, I mean, she's like the godmother of Boston in a lot of ways. I mean, wow.
Yeah. And some of Barbara Lynch's restaurants represented there as well. And we won a third time. And so that was really awesome. And it felt good, it felt like, okay, this is something we're great at, and our team was really stoked on it. And so it just felt great to be able to go up to my hometown and show people that we can represent. So that was great.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, so we had those 3 wins under our belt, and then kind of the fourth year, Brady called me and said, "Are you in or out?" And I said, "You know what? Every year that this thing comes around, we work. I mean, it's so much work. Not that I have any problem with that, but my guys have never been able to enjoy it. I'm like, we go, we bust our ass for a week getting this thing done and prepped up. We drive up there, we throw down, we win a trophy, and then we pack it all up and we drive home. I'm like, I would really love the opportunity to actually go and enjoy it and walk around and take my guys and, make a day out of it. So I said, why don't I kind of collaborate with you, and I'll help in some other ways. And, if it's some charcuterie you want, we can provide that. If it's some other things here and there, we can help out. But I think I don't want to compete this year. So we kind of backed out. We decided to kind of just take a back seat. And you know what? My staff went up. We had an awesome time. And everybody got to kind of experience the event from the other side, which I think is always very important for people. And so we had a great time. Plus, my really good friend, Jamie Bissonnette, had decided to compete that year, and he was kind of like, "Are you in? Are you going to do it?" And I said, "I don't know. Are you going to do it?" And we couldn't really decide what we were going to do. And then finally I said, "You know what? I don't want to compete against you anyways. Like, we're best friends. So why don't I go and walk around and drink bourbon, and you can compete, and I know you'll win anyways, and then we can party afterwards." So that was kind of the decision that was made.
Nice. Now, you talked about Providence and the city of Providence. Talk to me about the fabric of the dining scene there, because I imagine when you move in 2003, first of all, you've got this sort of old guard of the Italian places up on Federal Hill, which is what Providence is known for, and some great establishments like Al Forno that have been there for a long time. And you've also got Johnson & Wales University there, which is a fantastic culinary school. And now, since you've been there, there's sort of almost like this new crop of chefs that have come up. So talk to me about what's going on in Providence in the dining scene as a whole during your time there.
Well, it's changed a lot. I mean, my goodness, when we opened, there was definitely the Hill, right? And there was everything else. Providence is very much known for its Italian, section, its Little Italy, if you will. And while, of course, it's still a huge part of the fabric of the city, there's been a lot that's happened in 10 years. And there have been a lot of new kind of attempts at bringing Providence into kind of the 21st century of food, if you will. And I think a lot of that has to do, and credit is owed really more to the farmers than anything else. Rhode Island and southern Massachusetts is really, in my mind, kind of one of the most fertile, amazing landscapes in the country for small farmers. And we're so lucky to be here and to be situated in an area that has those rich agricultural roots, but can also draw from the influences from the ocean, which is nearby. So there's a lot that's going on here. It always has been, but only within the last 10 years, I think, has there been kind of that caliber of cook that's getting spun out from maybe some of these big name restaurants that want to do their own thing and want to create and want to use the right ingredients and want to focus on making really great food from locally driven sources. So we're seeing a lot more of that in New England and in southern New England in particular. So, when we opened, it was never with the intention of creating or promoting that movement. It was just because we wanted to do our own thing and we wanted to make good food. I mean, it was very simple, to be honest. I just wanted to have a place that served great food. But, while not wanting, of course, to take any credit for, the movement that's taken place here. I think that just by virtue of us kind of having the commitment that we do, it showed people that it's possible here. And so I think that it started to kind of generate some interest. And so it's really taken off. And like you say, there are some places now that kind of that next generation, now that we've been here 10 years, there's that next generation that's coming up right behind us, as always happens in communities. And we've got some great cooks who are opening their own restaurants. Just comes freshly to mind, my old chef de cuisine has opened his first restaurant downtown to rave reviews, and that's what it's all about.
Who is that? Is that Birch?
Yeah, Benjamin Sukul at Birch. Yeah, and Ben is a wildly talented cook and has a great place downtown, and so that's what it's about, and that's what I think is most fascinating to me about food. Is it's an evolution, and it should always be an evolution. And down the road, whether Ben decides he's going to be in that location for 100 years or not, he's going to have cooks that are going to come and go, and then his cooks are going to go, and add to the culinary landscape. And so, that's what it's about, and that's progression, and that's fascinating to me,
Right.
And I think that in a town like this, it could be viewed that, we all compete with each other, and it's so small, and we share the same customer base, and, it's too many restaurants for such a small city. But the reality is that we all make each other stronger. I'm sure that we share a great amount of customers, but what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and what's good for me is good for those guys, and what's good for those guys is good for me. I want to see them opening. I want to see more happening in the city. It adds vibrancy and makes us a destination. So that's kind of what's happening right now, and what's going on in Providence.
All right. Well, Matt Jennings of Farmstead, are you ready to play a little game?
I'll do my best.
Okay, here we go. This game is called Out of the Frying Pan. I'm going to ask you for a series of rapid-fire recommendations. You just tell me the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
First, you're obviously known for pork. Where do you go to buy your pork?
Well, I go to the farmer's market to buy my pork. We have a couple of great farmer's markets in Rhode Island. The one that I would focus on would probably be the Hope Street Market, which still has a number of weeks to go here in Providence. And in the wintertime, actually, it moves to Pawtucket. And there's one of the most vibrant indoor winter farmers markets there in Pawtucket. And specifically, I will go probably and shoulder tap my friend Pat McNiff at Casey Farm. He raises some beautiful hogs. And likewise for Blackbird Farm in Smithfield, they have some beautiful pork as well. Those are my go-tos.
All right. Let's say I'm walking into your cheese shop for the first time. I'm feeling adventurous. I want to try something new. What do you recommend, and where does it come from?
Well, I think, let's see, this time of year, I'd probably send you towards a Harbison, which we're going to be seeing a little bit more of from Jasper Hill Farm coming out very shortly in this season. And it's a soft, ripened cow's milk cheese, kind of built in the style of a Vacherin Mont d'Or, banded with a piece of spruce, and beautifully unctuous, creamy, and very decadent. So that's my go-to right now is Harbison from Jasper Hill Farm.
In the course of your career, talk to me about some of the chefs who have mentored you or that you've admired and who have influenced what you do today.
Well, there's quite a few. The ones who I think have really influenced me just off the top of my head would be Chef David Miles, formerly of the New England Culinary Institute. He was one of my instructors and mentors up there. Just all around great guy, super positive, really wanted kids to engage with their communities and, entrench themselves and learning as much as they could about the food culture where they lived. And so that was instilled in me from David at a very young age. Amanda Lydon and her husband, Gabriel Frasca, who now own a couple places out on Nantucket, but I worked with Amanda to help open one of her restaurants, or her first restaurant in the South End in Boston called Truc, which was a small little French bistro right on Tremont Street, and I learned a lot in the time that I spent there, and it was the first glimpse that I really got about, how hard owning your own business is, and the hours that get put in, and the commitment level that you have to have. So Amanda is somebody who I hold with very high regard, and her family is wonderful as well. I would also say Isan Gerdal, who, is not a chef, but is a food aficionado, and Isan taught me a lot in the retail side of things while I was at Formaggio, and kind of a whole new way of how to understand and appreciate what great food is and the artisans that create it. So.
All right. What about other chefs there in Providence? I mean, who should we watch? And again, I know there's so many, but who else do you really admire what they're doing in Providence?
I would say most certainly if driving just down the hill from me, Beau Vestal at New Rivers is one of my closest friends here, and also just a great chef. Super talented, super dedicated to quality. He is very much into the Rhode Island seafood, as well, and shellfish, and does some charcuterie of his own. And just a really great guy, very passionate. Derek Wagner at Nick's on Broadway. Another person that I met very early in the game here. And Derek operates breakfast, lunch, and dinner out of his restaurant on Broadway, and is just extremely dedicated and very interested in kind of moving the whole scene forward and progressing here with the producers that we have. I would also say Matt Januso at Chez Pascal. Matt was actually the first chef that I ever met in Providence. I knew him because I used to sell product to him when I was at Formaggio. He was buying some items from us up there. So when I moved to town, I went and knocked on Matt's door and said hello. Again, Matt's another one that's just puts himself in the mix every day and has just really interesting ideas. He's been really into sausage making, so he just put in a whole little sausage counter in the front of his restaurant. They cut a window out of the front wall, and you can walk up now in the summertime and get sausages right out of the side of the restaurant. There's a little takeaway. It's just brilliant. And he's got his sausage truck, Houghton's dog, of course. So those guys and many more, that's what's nice is that they're kind of getting peppered all over the state. The new generation of guys, as I mentioned, Ben Sukel at Birch, James Mark over at North, they're doing some really interesting things, and James has some great experience and is doing some really kind of very focused Asian-influenced cuisine on the west side now that has a great following. So a lot of good stuff going on.
All right, last question. You're a heavily tattooed fellow. You got a favorite tattoo? Which one is it?
I think the favorite is probably whatever the next one's going to be. I've still got some room left, and probably to my wife's chagrin, I'll continue to be a collector for years to come. But I think probably my bluefish is the one that I'm the most proud of right now. It's on my top of my left hand. My stepdad passed away a couple years ago, and he and I would go out bluefishing all the time, and bluefish was very big in my family as I was growing up. We'd always put bluefish on the grill in the summertime, and my mom make bluefish pate, and I don't know, it's a very kind of New England thing, and has always really meant a lot to me, so I wanted to kind of dedicate that to him. So I've got a big blue on my left fist, so that's probably the one that means the most.
All right. Well, Matt Jennings of Farmstead, thank you so much. We're really excited to see you at the Taste Trekkers Conference. Thank you so much for coming in and do the keynote speech. And I know people are thrilled to hear what you have to say. People can find Farmstead at 186 Wayland Avenue over on the east side of Providence. They can also find it online, farmsteadinc.com. What about you? If people want to follow you on social media, how can they do that?
They can find me both on Instagram and Twitter at Matthew Jennings, all one word, MattHewJenings.
Your Instagram feed is fantastic, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah, well, we have fun with it. It's a lot of people, my guys make fun of me here, because we'll do a menu change and I'm like crouched over every plate trying to get a sexy shot of it. But, they're beginning to understand that that's business too. That's, if it puts butts in seats, then it's worth it, right?
Right. Definitely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
All right, my name is Seth Ressler. This is the Fine Dining Podcast. Couple of notes before we go. You can find links to many of the places that Matt and I talked about on the website. While you're there, you can subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or however else you want. You can go to TuneIn or Stitcher Radio. You can also follow us on Twitter. We are Taste Trekkers, and you can find us on Facebook as well. And if you'd like to be a guest on the show, you want to come on and talk to us about the culinary scene in your city, just click the Contact Us link and send us an email. We'd love to have you on. Thank you so much for listening.
This is the Fine Dining Podcast. You can find links to the places mentioned in this episode at tastetrekkers.com. Tastetrekkers.com. Thank you for listening.